Never assume you'll escape prison or poverty. They say this proverb originated during the time of Ivan the Terrible, but it hasn't lost its relevance in modern Russia. At all times, under czars, general secretaries, and presidents, the Russian authorities have sent their subjects to prisons and camps for the slightest offense without hesitation, and often even without any offense at all. The terror against its own people reached its peak in the Soviet Union, when many millions of people went through the terrible meat grinder of the Gulag. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, they were completely innocent. Places of imprisonment in the USSR were a special world, with their own traditions and rules. They had a huge influence on Soviet society, even though the topic of prison life in the country was practically taboo. Today we will look at how people lived in Soviet camps and prisons, what rules they followed, how prisoners were divided into castes, what kind of work they did, and what they ate. My name is Semyon, and I declare the How They Lived section open. Let's begin. Prison is like a mirror of Soviet history. The rules in Soviet camps and prisons varied greatly depending on the period of USSR history. Although the Soviet penitentiary system was always characterized by extreme cruelty and a complete lack of compassion for human life. As soon as they came to power, the Bolsheviks immediately set about expanding the network of correctional institutions, because the existing prisons and camps quickly became overcrowded. And it was not only due to the worsening crime situation after the Civil War, but also because of the emergence of a new, numerous category of detainees, political prisoners. This category included all sorts of citizens who, in theory, might have been disloyal to the new government, or whom the authorities simply suspected of such disloyalty. This included former Tsarist officers and officials, clergy, members of bourgeois political parties, and representatives of the intelligentsia. In 1920, a correctional camp for criminal and political prisoners was established within the walls of the former Orthodox monastery on the Solovetsky Islands, the first island of what would become the vast Gulag archipelago. The Solovetsky Special Purpose Camp became the largest Soviet correctional labor camp of the 1920s. Over its 14 years of existence, more than 200,000 prisoners passed through it. Moreover, every third one of them died from inhumane conditions, torture, or was executed by shooting. The most famous prisoner of the Solovetsky camp was academician Dmitry Likhachev, a cultural scholar, researcher of Old Russian literature, and a world-renowned scholar. In 1928, he was sentenced to 5 years for participating in a student club, 3 of which the future scholar spent in Solovki. Likhachev managed to survive the hell of camp life. He left detailed memoirs about the Solovetsky camp and his time there. The main tool for re-educating prisoners in Soviet camps was hard labor, which in just a few months could turn a healthy man into a disabled man. This method was tested in Solovki and then spread to the other camps of the Gulag. Soviet prisoners felled trees, mined coal, gold, and oil, and built canals and railroads. By the mid-1930s, the camp system had become a crucial part of the Soviet Union's economy. The Dnipro HPP, Magnitka, and Norilsk Nickel were built by the labor of prisoners. At its peak, the Gulag archipelago consisted of 500 camp administrations with 30,000 sites and branches. Today, it's hard to say how many Soviet citizens went through the Gulag system. Historians estimate the number at 25 to 30 million people, while the total population of the country was less than 200 million. If you subtract from this number the children under 14 and the elderly over 60, it turns out that in the 1920s and 1950s, nearly 1 in 5 Soviet citizens passed through the prison system. After Stalin's death in 1953, the number of prisoners in camps and prisons began to decrease. Several large amnesties took place, and in 1960 the Gulag system itself was finally abolished. Under Khrushchev, mass reviews of political cases and rehabilitations of the wrongfully convicted began, although many of them were rehabilitated posthumously. In the later years of the USSR, there were comparatively few political prisoners, although even during the stagnation period, people ended up behind bars for reasons that would seem very strange to a modern person. For example, for parasitism. Yes, on the Soviet side, everyone was supposed to work. Most of those imprisoned under this article were beggars and alcoholics, but sometimes artists and poets as well. And also, in the later years of the USSR, you could easily be sent to Kolyma for any attempts at commercial activity. Back then, this was called speculation. In 1991, more than 3 million people were behind bars in the Soviet Union. Criminals and political prisoners. The Soviet criminal world was complex, divided into many castes, which I will talk about a bit later. But political prisoners were at the very bottom of this hierarchy. In places of detention, they endured not only extreme living conditions and abuse from the guards, but also attacks from criminal inmates, who were always supported by the prison and camp authorities. For the Soviet authorities, criminals were always considered a socially close element. It was believed that after serving their sentence, they could become normal Soviet citizens. The attitude toward political prisoners was completely different, because they had committed the most terrible crime. They had betrayed the motherland. That's why criminal offenders felt superior to political prisoners and believed they had the right to punish them using their own criminal methods. The administration and the guards usually turned a blind eye to all this abuse. Sharashkas, or Soviet camp institutes. The Soviet penitentiary system was unique in many ways. For example, in the 1930s through the 1950s, there were special institutions called Sharashkas. Convicted scientists and engineers were sent there, where they worked behind barbed wire on the most important secret projects. Neither before nor after has world history known anything like this, and in the Soviet Union, there were dozens of such institutions. And in them, inmates with academic degrees worked on creating new tanks, airplanes, missiles, chemical weapons, and later, atomic weapons. The cream of Soviet engineering thought passed through the Sharashkas. Glushko, Kondratyuk, Korolev, Tupolev, Petliakov, and Polikarpov worked in them. It should be added that the living conditions in the Sharashkas were nothing like those in the camps. So, you could say that people who ended up there were very lucky. However, for any offense, they could easily end up at the logging camps. The transfer from the camp to the Sharashka actually saved the life of Sergei Korolev, the father of the Soviet space program. The writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who himself spent time in a Sharashka, wrote the novel In the First Circle many years later, where he described the life in such institutions in detail. The Bitch War. As I already mentioned, the Soviet criminal world was complexly structured. There were different groups within it, and the relationships between them were far from always peaceful. For example, in the late 1940s, the so-called Bitches' War broke out in the camps and prisons. A fierce conflict erupted between the so-called honest thieves, who rejected and denied any contact with the authorities, and the bitches, criminals, who chose to cooperate with the administration. One of the main reasons for this bloody conflict was the participation of many criminals in the war against Hitler's Germany. According to the Thieves' Code, this was unacceptable, because a true convict had no right to cooperate with the authorities, let alone take weapons from their hands. Those who broke this law were considered traitors and were forever expelled from the thieves' caste. After the war ended, former criminal frontline soldiers returned to their usual activities once they were free. As a result, they started ending up in prisons and camps again, where they inevitably had conflicts with the proper thieves and criminal authorities. The Bitches' War claimed quite a few victims. Arson between thieves and bitches became a common occurrence. Sometimes entire battles took place in the camps, with dozens killed. In the Bitches' War, the camp administration initially supported the bitches, hoping to use them to rein in and weaken the old thieves. But very quickly, things got out of control and a bloody rampage began in the prisons. In the end, the thieves and the bitches were separated into different camps. Only after that did the bloodshed begin to subside. The cold summer of '53. On March 5, 1953, Stalin died. And already on March 23, the largest amnesty in the USSR was announced, under which more than 1.2 million people were released. It was called the Voroshilov Amnesty, although the real initiator was a completely different person, the all-powerful head of state security, Lavrenti Beria. But, as it turned out, they were mainly releasing not political prisoners, but real criminals. The overwhelming majority of those released were criminals, including those convicted of serious offenses such as murder, rape, and robbery. The simultaneous release of such a large number of professional criminals, as expected, simply blew the situation wide open. Moreover, in the following years, real hell began in Soviet cities. Many of them literally ended up in the hands of the criminal element. Robberies and murders took place in broad daylight, on the streets, in markets, and on public transport. The police couldn't do anything about it. It just lacked enough manpower for that. Complaints about rampant crime literally poured into Moscow from different cities across the country. Moreover, many of them contained heartbreaking details. In 1953, due to the announced amnesty, the number of serious crimes in the country sharply increased. Incidents of banditry by 72%, murders by 47%, armed robberies by 176%, pickpocketing by 137%, and rapes by 43.1%. It took law enforcement several years to catch the released criminals again and send them back to prison. Historians still argue about why millions of dangerous criminals were released. For example, Khrushchev believed that Beria carried out the amnesty to buy off the public. According to another version, by provoking a surge in crime in the country, he wanted to gain unlimited powers for his agency. However, most likely, the reason lies in the crisis of the camp system itself, which by the early 1950s was already unable to cope with the influx of prisoners. Their slave labor was so inefficient that it simply did not cover the costs of security and maintenance. The country's economy could no longer support the upkeep of the Gulag. In such a situation, reducing the number of prisoners was the simplest solution. As usual, no one even thought about the problems that the population would face. Prison castes in the USSR. I have already said more than once that the Soviet criminal world was not homogeneous. There was an informal hierarchy within it, which, by the way, has remained almost unchanged to this day. It is believed that it took shape around the mid-1930s. There were four main prison castes or ranks. The first, the highest caste, were the blatny, criminal elite. The second, the most numerous, were the muzhiki, ordinary inmates. The third were the activists, or kozli, collaborators. And the fourth, the lowest, were the opushcheni, or petuki, outcasts. Depending on which caste a prisoner belonged to, he had certain rights and responsibilities. There were also intermediate castes. Their number and characteristics largely depended on the specific camp or zone. Blatnie. Blatny are the highest caste in the Soviet prison hierarchy. They were the elite of the criminal world of the USSR, consisting of professional criminals. For them, serving time was a mandatory stage in their professional career. Usually, it was the blatny who held the real power in the prison or the camp. They called themselves arrestanti, bosyaki, brodiagi. It was extremely difficult to get into the highest prison caste. Any stain in your biography would close this path forever. For example, a prisoner who had been a member of the Komsomol or served in the army, worked as a waiter, taxi driver, or other service staff could not become a blatnoy. Blatny, as a rule, did not work in the camp and did not hold any official positions. Blatny took care of supplying the prison or camp with food, alcohol, tea, and settled disputes between inmates according to the criminal underworld's code. Muzhiki. Muzhiki are the largest caste in Soviet places of detention. It consisted of people who ended up behind bars, generally by accident. However, the word accidentally in this context doesn't mean they are innocent. It just means that these people didn't consciously choose a criminal career, unlike the so-called blatnai. Usually, muzhiki were imprisoned for theft, drunken fights, murders, and embezzlement. In the camps, they worked and acknowledged the authority of the blatny. Moreover, they couldn't interfere in the affairs of the latter and had no right to vote at thieves' gatherings. Kozli. Kozli or Suki are inmates who openly cooperated with the prison or camp administration. They held some kind of position, like a supply manager or a commandant, for example, or were part of the camp's amateur activities. The word kozel and any derivatives of it were, and most likely still are, serious insults in the criminal world. The kozel themselves usually called themselves activists, or simply the active group. The camp administration called them that as well. Prisoners from other castes always treated the kozel badly, since they considered them traitors. The opuszczenia. The opuszczenie, or petuki, are the lowest caste in the criminal world. That's how it was in Soviet times, and that's how it remains today. This is a caste of outcasts, untouchables, some of whom played the passive role. Well, you get the idea. The opuszczeni had separate bunks in the barracks or cell, a separate place at the table, their own dishes. Other inmates are not allowed to touch the opuszczeni. If they do, they are also transferred to the caste of outcasts. However, most often in Soviet prisons, inmates became opuszczeni for serious violations of the criminal code of conduct. Snitching, stealing from fellow inmates, and not paying card debts. It's hard to say when the caste of such outcasts appeared in Soviet prisons. Some researchers believe that this happened in the 1930s when teenagers began to be sent to the Gulag en masse, and they were forced into depraved relationships. Instead of a conclusion, the topic of Soviet prisons and camps did not attract researchers' attention until later. And this does not seem like a coincidence, considering the role that places of imprisonment played not only in Soviet history, but also in the formation of Soviet society itself. Tens of millions of people passed through the camps and prisons of the Gulag. After returning from there, they brought with them the thieves' code and a criminal outlook on the world. All of this was dormant somewhere until the wild 90s swept over the country. And that's when it became clear that the Gulag had never really gone anywhere. Former Soviet citizens accepted the new criminal rules far too easily. Probably, to cleanse ourselves of this legacy, it will take several generations to pass, as well as a full understanding of this tragic chapter in history. That's all. Goodbye, everyone.